Photosynthesis. As we all know, plants need sunlight in order to survive. Now we're going to learn about how light is important to plant. Well, plants use a process called photosynthesis in order to produce sugar, which is then converted to energy in order for the plant to survive. So take an example of this tree right here. Tree absorbs sunlight using the leaves. And then how does the leaves absorb the sunlight? Well, inside the leaves there are teeny tiny little bits of plant cells that looks like this, and then inside the plant cells are chloroplasts, which is responsible for absorbing the light. So over here we see it's a zoom in version of a chloroplast. Inside the chloroplast are these little green thing called the thylakoid, and then the thylakoid inside the chloroplast is responsible for absorbing the light. So as we can see that it is very important how light is responsible for photosynthesis. Without light, plants eventually will die. So let's see how light plays in the role of photosynthesis. So right here is our chloroplast again with the thylakoid, and here's the same one. Now we're going to take a zoom in version of a thylakoid. So this right here is like a thylakoid zoom in, and we are looking at the membrane of the thylakoid. In the thylakoid, there are teeny tiny little protein structure that is integrated into the membrane. These structure carry this little green thing called a pigment, and they're the one responsible for absorbing the light. So that's a lot of stuff. First we have the tree. Inside the tree is the cell. Inside the cell is the chloroplast. Inside the chloroplast is the thylakoid. Inside the thylakoid is a protein, and finally inside the protein is a pigment. Whew, that's a lot. So the pigment is the one who's really responsible for absorbing the light. The purpose of the pigment absorbing the light is so it will hit the electron, and the electron is going to travel through the membrane. When the electron travels through the membrane, all the hydrogen in the outside of the thylakoid is going to be absorbed into the inside of the thylakoid. After that, once the hydrogens are found inside the thylakoid, it's going to be fully charged with energy. It's going to be shoot out of the thylakoid. And then, because it's being shot out through a thylakoid, through another process, it's going to create ATP. So one of the product of the photosynthesis so far in the first step is to create ATP. And then the extra H that's already floating on the outside, an electron carrier called NADP plus is going to bind with the electron, and it's also going to bind with the hydrogen that's floating outside to create NADPH. Both ATP and NADPH are going to be carried into the Calvin cycle. Inside the Calvin cycle, that's step 2 of photosynthesis. We'll learn more about that later. So the question is, where does hydrogen and the electron come from? Well, remember what are 3 things that plants need? Plants need light, carbon dioxide, and the third thing is from the root is water. So the H and the electron comes from water. So we have water right here, and it's going to be broken down into 3 parts. The electron, which provide the electrons for the electron flow, the hydrogen, which is then it's already inside the thylakoid, pumps outside, gives the energy, and then it's pumps back inside via the electron. And third thing is oxygen. Plants doesn't use oxygen, so it's going to release oxygen into the atmosphere as a waste product, which is for us, we takes in oxygen and then we give back carbon dioxide to the plant. So that's where the hydrogen and the electron come from for the thylakoid. So here we see the same picture of the chloroplast again. This time we just zoom outside of the thylakoid. We're going to look at the overall picture. So first of all, you have light that's being absorbed by the pigment, and then you also have water that's also being absorbed by the plant. When water is absorbed, you produce the hydrogen and the electron, and oxygen, which is released as a waste product, so it's not used. Then also ATP and NADPH is going to be your final product, and that's going to be transferred from the thylakoid into the next step, which is called the Calvin cycle. Now the Calvin cycle is going to absorb CO2, carbon dioxide, so it's going to use 3 things. So Calvin cycle uses 3 things: carbon dioxide, ATP, and NADPH in order to produce the final product, which is glucose, and glucose is sugar. Now this whole process is called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, the word synthesis means to make or to put together, and the word photo means light. So photosynthesis is a process where you're making something, in this case sugar, by using light. So you're making something using light in order to make, so the photosynthesis makes sugar. Sugar is then used by the plants as an energy source, which is broken down by the mitochondria in the plant. So we see this whole time how water and light is important for the plant. Without water, there is no H and there is no electron, so that's why plants die if there's no water. And then also because there's no light, without light, it cannot push the electron, and then the plant will also die as well. Okay, now going back to our figure again, we're zooming back into the thylakoid. So the question is, how is water broken down into the three parts? Water is broken down into three parts by a process called photolysis. The word lysis means to break apart, and the word photo, if we remember, means light. So you're breaking apart something using light. So light is important for two purposes. One is to transfer the electron, and the other purpose is to break H2O into its components to be used by photosynthesis. So that's why light is very important for the plant. So a plant without light will eventually die, because since there is no electron flow, there will be no creation of NADPH and ATP, and then photosynthesis basically just shut down halfway, and that's why plants die if there's no light. Now moving over here, there is a name for how the creation of ATP. When H is shot through this little protein called the ATP synthase, and then it's bind with ADP to produce ATP. This process is called chemiosmosis. Now this whole thing that's happening inside the thylakoid, where the electron is flowing and the production of ATP and NADPH, this is called the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is the location, which is the membrane of the thylakoid. That's where everything is happening, the very first step of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, the final product, is to make sugar. But in order to make sugar, it uses light in order to make sugar. Light has two purposes, to push the electron and to break down water. So water is also important for plants as well. It's provided with the hydrogen and the electron, which is in turn used to create ATP, and then also NADPH. Both ATP and NADPH is carried to the Calvin cycle, which is the second step of the second and the final step of photosynthesis to make glucose. And that's pretty much it so far for photosynthesis. We'll get more into Calvin cycle later.